that working? Can you hear me? Excellent. Oh, I can see Eileen can hear at the back. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dave Dean and also his wife, who's in the audience, Carol, because both of them are coming back. This is the first in a series of talks that they're both going to do. I did say to them, I just can't believe people who will voluntarily submit themselves to the horrors of having to deal with all this kit and to get it on the screen, which I find perfectly frightful. But you're such old hands now, I think that it comes naturally. So I won't go on any more other than to say we're delighted that you're here. We've heard much about you, cracking talk that you give. Thank you very much for coming. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you for that wonderful invite. We're going to talk about people who demonstrated intellect tonight. And you've demonstrated incredible intellect by inviting us here today. So, thank you. As you've heard, my name is Dave, and at the back is my lovely wife, Carol. Now, if at any point you can't hear, please ask and I'll speak up, or some of the wonderful sound people might turn the volume on. Now, as we go through the talk tonight, we are going to talk about the Second World War. We're going to talk about our side and their side. But as we go through, I don't want to demonise any people or peoples. Everyone in the war fought in the war because their government told them to fight. So I really don't want to demonise this group of people or that group of people. Now I want to start by asking you all a question. Are you happy with the government? Now, I'm not talking about this government, I mean any government, because if you're not happy, there's things you can do. You can wave placards outside the House of Parliament. You can go to the newspapers, the radio. You can talk to your friends down the pub. And the reason you can do all these things is because we won the Second World War. These freedoms that we consider basic, we won. Had we lost that war, these things might not have been available to us. Now we're going to go back to the Second World War, and we're going to see how a relatively small group of women and men worked together toiled in secret to break the enemy codes. Thanks to these people, we could understand and read every single secret code the enemy sent to themselves. And they fought not with guns and bullets, but with intellect. Now we all know the dates of the Second World War, don't we? The Second World War was between 1939 and 1945. However, had it not been for the people that we're going to hear about today, the dates of the Second World War would probably have been 1939 to 1949, because they reduced the length of the war by up to 4 years. And I bet you now, many of you will have heard of the code breakers down at Bletchley Park. And when you heard about them, I bet you've heard about these people here. And when you look at the names on the screen, they're all men, aren't they? However, at its height, in 1944, there were about 9,000 people working at the park, and of these, 75% of these were women. 6,757. And that is why I called my talk The Women and Men of Bletchley Park. So the world is at war, and Britain is losing. Our way of life is at risk. The enemy is at the door. Our situation is dire. It is our darkest hour, and the future of the world is at stake. Second World War brought many new types of warfare and developments in warfare. There was the Blitzkrieg, where everything was thrown at a target. Everything fell before the power of the Blitzkrieg. There was the regular, daily bombardments, which happened in World War I, but they were far more intense in World War II. And there was a lot more use of radio traffic over the airwaves, Morse code. In fact, a lot of people call the Second World War the wireless war. But there was a problem with this. I mean, the Germans spent years training thousands of operators to send Morse code. It didn't matter where they were. They could be on the plane, on the roughest air, they could be on a rough sea, they could be in a tank bouncing over the land. Wherever they were, these guys could transmit their Morse code with absolute accuracy. They were really excellent at what they did. But there was a problem here, because when they transmitted, everyone could read what they sent. Now, there's no point sending a secret message, we're going to attack at dawn, if the enemy can read and intercept that. And the answer to this little problem was this thing. This thing is called the Enigma device. The Enigma device was invented in 1918. It was invented not by the military, but by business. It was used extensively by the railways and the banks. And these people could send signals in secret, and no one else could read if they were intercepted. But how did it work? Every day, thousands upon thousands of signals were to be sent by the Germans. They were typed into the Enigma device, and the Enigma would encode it. And it became a random set of letters. And then they would send by Morse code this random set of letters. It was picked up by a receiving Enigma device, configured the same as the sender, and when you typed it in there, it decoded the signal. But if anyone else read that signal, all they saw was a set of random letters. Now, the Germans saw the possibilities of this, and they augmented it. They made it far more secure. So exactly how did it work? Well, before I go on, when I started giving this talk, people said this is far too complex, the Enigma device. So I've taken it down a little bit of a level, but if you want to ask me more about it, please do later on. That is the Enigma device. So if you're going to send a signal, what you would do is you would take your signal in plain text, unencoded, and you would type, for example, the letter B on the keyboard. Now you see above the keyboard, you've got these, what you call, rotors. Now, has anyone got a combination lock? You see the lock? And they've got all the little dials with all the numbers 0 through 9. That's a rotor. So they have these rotors. The only thing is, these had letters A through Z. And they were full of wiring, incredibly complex wiring. And so what happened was, when you pressed the letter B on the keyboard, the rotors encoded that letter B. The rotors and all sorts of other bits and bobs encoded the letter B. Encoded it perhaps to a letter Y. And on the lamp board above, the letter Y was displayed, the encoded letter. But the brilliant thing was that when the rotors had encoded the letter, they rotated. So if you then typed in another letter, it would encode it, but in a completely different way. Now, the only thing we really need to take away from this little bit of the talk is it's incredibly complex. And the other thing is there's a concept of settings. We're going to talk about these all the way through the talk. And the settings are really important. If you take that combination lock, if you look at the rotors, and it might have number 1, 2, 3, the numbers you can see, that would be part of the setting. Now, there's loads of settings on the Enigma device. And they were brilliant because unless the receiving Enigma was set at the same as the sending, you couldn't decipher anything. So, if you were to type the letter K, it might convert in this example to the letter S. And if you then type the letter D, it would convert perhaps to a B. But because the rotors were rotating, if you then typed K and D again, it would convert to something completely different. Now, talk about these settings. The total number of settings on the Enigma device is 150 million. And this meant the Enigma codes were unbreakable. If the sending Enigma and the receiving Enigma were not set up identical to the right setting of 101 from the 150 million, you would read nothing. It would be all random letters. And this meant that the Germans had invented a totally unbreakable code, and this proved to be the bedrock of their comms policies. Well, in 1938, our government bought Bletchley Park, a manor down near Milton Keynes, 50 miles north of London. And this was to become the centre for code breaking during World War II. And they called it Station X. And only the brightest people they could think of went there, like this man. And I'm going to confess here, this man is one of my historical favourites. His name is Dilwyn Knox, or Dilly Knox. And Dilly Knox plays a massive part in our story. He was a veteran code breaker from World War I, but he was very absent-minded. So when he was working in the park, when he was working in a room, they called all the buildings huts. So he was working in a hut, he would smoke his pipe. And he's so absent-minded that when he's trying to fill his pipe, he filled it with whatever was to hand. So cheese butty went into his pipe. He was so absent-minded, when he got married, he forgot to invite his 3 brothers. This is the kind of man we're talking about. And this is the man that we are going to depend on during the war to crack the codes. But there's a but with this, and it's a big but. And that but is that Dilly Knox was absolutely, mind-numbingly brilliant. There's another man, you might have heard of this man. His name was Alan Turing. Alan Turing was brilliant. He was a Cambridge professor when he was 22. That's how clever Alan Turing was. But he had a little bit of an oddity as well. He was billeted near the park, and he travelled to and from on a pedal bike. And when he was going in the summer, to protect himself from hay fever, he wore his gas mask. And so he rode past the locals, and they all looked at this man and thought, I've missed the air raid warning, and got into a panic mode. Now, I don't know if anyone has seen the film The Imitation Game. I don't know where they got the idea from. Alan Turing was a very nice man. He's not as depicted in the film. A very nice man. He was brilliant. Rather than the way you see him in the film, he was incredibly popular with people. What he did was he was uncomfortable around some people, often women. He didn't make them uncomfortable, he was uncomfortable himself. And yet they all loved him. And they loved this nice man because they could see this man would play a pivotal role in the war. And he did. So the one-time head of the park, Commander Alistair Denniston, they called him Guthrie. Commander Denniston was authorised to recruit 57 professor-type men. It was only the men they wanted. They wanted the best and they wanted the brightest. But they couldn't advertise, and so they used the old boy network. And that's one of the reasons the park was based where it was. Because at Milton Keynes, it is equidistant from the universities. Both of them. And they went back to universities and they brought the best minds, the mathematical minds, the linguists. Always the man, they're always the men. But they didn't care who you were. They didn't bother about societal norms. And this meant you might get a school leaver working with a very experienced professor. They didn't care about any of this. But you know, they do say the more brilliant you are, the more weird you are. Now that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. So they brought the best and the brightest from Oxford and Cambridge. They brought them to the park, including a man named Cooper. Now anyone who's been to the park will know at the front of the park is a rather nice little lake. It probably takes about 5 or 10 minutes to walk around. And Cooper walked around it every evening. And he took with him a cup of coffee. Every evening he got to the end of the lake, done with his coffee, didn't know what to do with the cup, and simply lobbed it into the lake. There's more crockery in there than Stoke. And then there was another man. He had a little goatee beard. And in the winter, he would wear a pixie hat to cover the beard to stop it from freezing. I'm a cyclist, and I tell you, they freeze. But it was not only men who worked at the park. Like I said before, 6,757 women worked at the park at its height. And these women had to be recruited too. So how do you recruit them? You can't stick an advert in the Times, top secret code breaker wanted, please apply within. So again, they went back to the universities. And the women who had the right mind, they were quietly absconded and taken and placed in the park. But they needed doers as well as the real intellects as well. And they decided they wanted to look at debutantes. Now, debutantes were the daughters of the highest in the land, the wealthiest and the most noble. Now, these young women owed their role in society to that society. And therefore it was felt they might not be the intellectual level of Dilly Knox and Co., but because they owed their position to that society, they would never betray our society. They would be the most loyal people they could get. And so they started recruiting women. They needed linguists and mathematical experts. And then they discovered that those people who were good at crossword had exactly the right kind of brain they needed. And so in 1942, the Daily Telegraph ran a crossword contest. And one Saturday morning, 30-odd people trooped down to the telegraph offices down in London, and they did the test. And they did it like an exam. And at the end of the test, there were winners and losers, and everyone was happy. And they all went away. But the 4 people who completed the crossword in under 12 minutes were secretly contacted. Do you want to become a code breaker? So now they're beginning to fill up with staff, and these people need something to do. Well, the government had set up, in secret, wireless intercept listening stations, wireless intercept stations right the way across the country and some of the other places in the old empire. And these wireless intercept stations suddenly became known as WI stations. And so obviously they were called Y stations to go alongside Station X. There were even some in our area. And they staffed these people with women from the military and the ministries. All the signals that they intercepted on the radio were encoded. They could read nothing. It was a random set of letters. And what these women would do is scan the airwaves every day. They would scan all day. When they discovered Morse code, they would record it. If the signal dropped out, or if they missed the end of a signal, they'd have to write down how many letters they'd missed, because this might be useful to the code breakers. And then they discovered that as the sender was transmitting in Morse code, the sender's way of transmitting was like a fingerprint. And they began to know the people who were sending them. Now, I loved typing this slide, by the way. I can't type for toffee. And this is the only time I could type it right first time. But these people got so busy that on the really busy days, and this was most of them, their hands suffered badly from the cramp. They were that busy. They were on the go all the time. And all these signals were encoded. They couldn't read any of them. Almost. Every now and again a signal would come through and it would be in plain text, not encoded. And these kind of signals were always the same. It was an Enigma operator who thought he was going to be taken prisoner or killed, and it's this last desperate signal, please tell my loved ones, whatever. And they were invariably stamped down with an immediate response, encode everything you send. So now, what you've got is these piles of signals. They can't read them, all encoded, piles of signals, and they gave them to female motorcycle couriers to take them down to Station X. Now, in a time when it was policy for women to be non-combatants, all these couriers were armed and expected to use it because what they carried was top secret. So, now they've got the signals, but they can't read them. They need to crack the code. The race was on. This is 1939. We have to crack the code, and we have to do it quickly. And Dilly Knox was trying to crack them, and Dilly Knox was stumped in 1939. In 1925, Dilly Knox had been in Vienna, Austria, and he bought an old Enigma device, a pre-augmented Enigma device. So he bought this. And in 1937, a man named Hugo Foss started trying to crack the Enigma. He didn't get there, but he made a very important discovery. And this is something we're going to keep coming back to. He discovered the concept of a crib. Now, all these signals were encoded. You can't read any words in them. But Hugo Foss realised that if you knew what you were looking for to a code breaker, it was like manna from heaven. So if you're looking for the phrase "nothing to report," even though it's encoded, might mean nothing to you or I, but to a code breaker, that was a step closer. And they called this the crib. If you know what you're looking for, it's easy to find. Well, in 1937, Dilly Knox started taking over from where Hugo Foss left over. And he was stumped. He couldn't make any more progress. So to understand why he did what he did, why he went where he went, we need to go back in time to 1931. And a man named Hans Philo Schmidt. Hans Philo was a veteran of World War I, Enigma operator, and he had all sorts of Enigma documents. And he saw a way of making easy money. So what Hans Philo did was he went to the government in France wanting to sell the documents. And they bought them. They bought them lock, stock and barrel. And they gave it to their secret intel services to try and use them to crack the Enigma, and they couldn't. So they gave it to the Brits. And they said, "Can you break it?" And we couldn't do anything either. And they finally gave it to the Poles. They gave it to the Poles, and they ended up in the hands of 3 mathematical experts. And I will not be disrespectful and try and pronounce their names, but these guys were brilliant. And they made a lot of progress, far more than anybody else. And this is why in 1939, Dilly Knox went to a forest near Warsaw in Poland, and he met these mathematical experts. And they had created a device, and this device was magnificent. We talked about 150 million settings. Well, what this device did is it went through every single setting of the 150 million, every single one, and every time it looked at a setting, it tried to work out if this is a possible setting to crack the Enigma. If it was, the Enigma, the device stopped, they gave it to a code breaker, they would play around and say, yes it is, or no it is, the right settings, and if it was wrong, it carried on and looked for more possible settings. And all the time it did this, it ticked. It ticked like a bomb. And so they called this thing the bomb. So what the bomb didn't do was it didn't decode the signal, it gave the possible settings for the Enigma device of the 150 million settings. And the Poles could read 75% of the signals that were sent. But then disaster struck in 1939 because the Germans altered the way the Enigma worked, and everything went dark. No one could read anything. Back to square one. Well, the code breakers at the park, they still couldn't read anything at all, but they had discovered something. They had discovered that there were what I call different flavours of enigma, different types of signal. So simplistically, and it is simplistically, you might say you've got the Army, the Air Force and the Navy. A bit simplistic, isn't it? And they looked at these and they wanted to name them. Now these are the brightest people in the land. You'd think they'd find a really clever way of naming these flavours of enigma. They were sitting there talking about it one day, and one of the code breakers picked up a red pen. And Enigma Red was born, then Enigma Green, and then Enigma Blue. They didn't know who it was. You know, red might be the Army, green might be the Air Force. They didn't know, but they knew they had these different types of enigma. And then as more codes came along, they went through more colours. Brown, purple, indigo. And then they went on to anything that lived anywhere near the sea. But they still couldn't read anything at all. They were no further forward. And so Alan Turing went back to see the three brilliant pole mathematical experts. And here opinions are divided. Some books will tell you that when Turing met the poles, he realised that the poles had accidentally misled Dilly Knox. Other books would tell you that Dilly Knox misunderstood it. Whatever the truth is, Alan Turing realised what was missing, he had the missing link, and he came back and he told Dilly Knox the updates. Dilly Knox tried to crack the enigma, and bingo, he did. He cracked the codes for Enigma Red on 2 dates, and it turns out Enigma Red is the Air Force, and Enigma Green is the Army. And the code's altered periodically. But once you crack the code, every signal for that day, week or month, you could read until the codes altered. And this was brilliant. They had proved they could crack the codes. I mean, there was a long way to go, but at least they could make a start. And Alan Turing immediately started to create our own bomb. Now again, the bombs don't decode the signals. What they do is they look at the possible enigma settings out of the 150 million settings. And he created the bomb. And these things are massive. I don't know if you've seen them. They're 6 foot by 6 foot. Every bomb contains 12 miles of wiring, and it costs a third of the price of a bomber. And in total, they got the equivalent of today's money, £8 million to develop the bombs. And I can't overemphasize the massive impact the bombs had on the war, because these allowed the code breakers to crack the signals. And they cracked the Army. And the Army cracked all the way through the war. There was never a point when they couldn't read any Army signal. But then they had a problem. We've tracked the signal, we can now decode it, but we don't know what it means. And so they gave it to the military analysts, and they looked at the signals, and they put it into context. And then they hit another problem. They could crack and translate all the Army signals, but they had to use that intel and pass it on to our military in a way that our military didn't realise we had cracked the code. And the way they did it was they went to the spies. There was a spy network called Boniface. And Boniface had operatives right the way across the enemy military, right the way across, feeding all sorts of good intel through. And they thought, what we'll do is we'll feed all the data that we've decoded along with the Boniface data. And they think it came from the spies. And they started to call it Ultra at this point. They had to make up stories. Because if the signal broke up when they were reading the radio transmission, they'd miss letters. And they would say things like, letters are missing because the spy grabbed it from the fire when it was being destroyed. And the senior members of the military were so impressed. You have got some very, very brave spies. You know, this man, Admiral Air Commodore Nutting. You've got so brave people, the spy is really impressed. And this is when I upset somebody. Because I'm afraid the Boniface spy network was no more real than Santa. The whole Boniface spy network was invented to pass out all the decoded signals. The whole thing was a lie. But then in April 1940, the phony war came to an end. That's the name given to the first few months of the war with the BEF and all the rest of it. The first few months of the war. On May the 10th, Hitler started storming across Europe, and then he headed up to Norway. And almost immediately, a new enigma appeared, Enigma Yellow, for all activities in Norway. Within 6 days, Enigma Yellow was cracked. Now think about that. That means everything, every single thing the army say to one another in Norway, you can read it all. There's nothing that you can't read. But they still couldn't read the Luftwaffe, and they still couldn't read the Navy. We had to crack the Luftwaffe code, Enigma Red. We had to crack it. And it refused to crack. The Luftwaffe did things differently. They used a code book. As well as the Enigma, they used a code book. And the code book had 6 letters. And when you took the 6 letters, they gave you a lookup to all the settings you needed, the 150 million settings. It looked up and gave you the settings. And the 6 letters for the look into the code book were hidden in the signal. The first 6 letters of any signal was the lookup into that code book. And they were broken into 2 groups of 3. The first 3 were unencoded letters, so whatever they sent is what you receive. And the second 3 were encoded. And all these letters were random letters, there were never any words, until they met Walter. Walter was an Enigma operator, and Walter had a girlfriend called Clara. And every time Walter sent these 6 letters, the first 3, not encoded, were always the same, W-A-L for Walter. And the second 3, encoded, was always C-L-A for Clara. And what this meant was every time Walter sent a signal, he sent a crib. If you know what you're looking for, it's easy to find. And then they looked for other words. And people use words. These so-called random letters were sometimes words. Yeah, Walter, Clara, London, Berlin, Hitler. Oh yeah, and all the rude words were in there as well. Yeah, definitely all the rude ones. And so they could crack some of the signals. But what about the Enigma operators who didn't use words, who did use random letters? Well, this is where code break, a young man called John Herrival came and gave him a big break. Herrival had been working for weeks trying to break the codes, and he was stumped. He made no progress, and so he gave up and he turned the problem on its head. Rather than break the code, let's break the code, the Enigma operator. Because we know what the Enigma operators are meant to do. Every day, when they send a signal, they give the rotors a hard spin. You know that combination lock? When you set it, you give it a hard spin afterwards to totally randomize the letters. But what happened, said Herrival, what happens if they don't give it a hard spin, but give it a half-hearted spin? Instead of thousands of combinations, you've got a few hundred. And the Herrival tip, as it was called, was passed in secret to Hut 12, the Enigma hut for the Luftwaffe, sent in secret to Hut 12, and all of a sudden they had cracked the Enigma code due to user error and some brilliant people. And the Luftwaffe was cracked every day until the end of the war. Whatever they sent, we could read. Absolutely everything. In fact, it got so routine that if the military analysts in Hut 3, if they didn't get it by 6 o'clock in the morning, they got incredibly annoyed. Where are our track signals? That's how routine it was. But all of this was top secret. Nobody must ever know we had cracked the code. If they did, then the Germans would update the way things were done and we're back to square one. So the number of people in the military who knew we cracked the code was the princely sum of 30 people. There's hundreds of thousands of people in the army, and only 30 knew what was going on at the park. That's how secret it was. And then things really started to get busy. They were getting more and more signals a day, and they couldn't cope. And so they needed to recruit more people. So they went back to the devs, the debutantes, and they recruited more. And they were surprised. In a place where accuracy was vital, these debutantes had to be taught to spell properly. And they went back to the military, the ATS, the WAF and the RENs, and they went back to the ministries, and they pulled all the people with the necessary skills. Skills like filing and typists. Oh, what the heck do you need typists for? And they couldn't get enough good typists. And the reason is because of this thing. This thing is called a typex. And this thing is the antidote to the Enigma. We've talked about these 150 million settings. If you type in the Enigma, put the Enigma settings in here, when you type in a signal, you either get a nib signal coming out or total twaddle. And all these needed skilled typists. They needed filing clerks. They needed filing clerks because there was an area in the park called the registry. And every single piece of military intel was meticulously recorded on cards and stored in the registry. So when you go in this room, you'd think there'd be rows and rows of gleaming filing cabinets. Nah, they used boot boxes. And this amused the Americans incredibly when they came over. But this is now 1940. In 1940 was the darkest hour and the Battle of Britain. Between July 1940 and October 1940, we have the Battle of Britain. And as soon as the Battle of Britain started, a new enigma appeared, Enigma Brown. Enigma Brown was cracked pretty well immediately. And Enigma Brown was vital. Hitler had spent a lot of time building radio antennae in Europe. And all these antennae broadcast Enigma Brown. And what they did was one of these radio antennae would broadcast Enigma Brown. And the Pathfinder aircraft at the head of the squadron would find the signal and go along the beam. And when it came across another Enigma beam, crossing its path where the two signals crossed, X marks the spot, and you drop the bombs. And now we have decoded this. The RAF were always in the right place at the right time. And the RAF won the Battle of Britain. Had it not been for that, we would have been invaded. But all these people worked in the hut, and the war never ended. They lived in these little huts, or worked in these little huts. But every now and again, the war did come in, and when it came, it kicked down the door in style. There was one lady codebreaker, Pat Bing, discovered. We talked about the Luftwaffe code books with the 6 letters that gave the settings. Pat Bing was given a newly recovered code book to play with. And on the cover of the code book was covered in dried blood. And when Pat opened the code book, inside it was covered in blood, but the blood there was wet. And Pat realised that only a few hours before, the Enigma operator had been in a fight for his life and probably lost. That's why Pat had the book, and the war kicked in the front door. So we were to crack the Army Enigma and the Air Force Enigma, but the Naval Enigma we couldn't crack. And it was vital that it was cracked. As a country, we had not learned a lesson from World War I, and we still imported vast amounts of materials and foodstuff from America. And of course, it all came across the Atlantic in convoys. The convoys protected by the Royal Navy. And this was a risk, and the threat came in the form of this man. His name is Admiral Carl Dönitz, and Admiral Dönitz ran the North Atlantic fleet of submarines. They called them U-boats. And if you look at the Atlantic, you've got America over there and Blighty over here. Either side of the Atlantic, the Air Force can fly over the sea, and if there's a U-boat there, they can see it. But there comes a point where it's too far from land. The Air Force can't go. And you've got this kind of dead zone in the middle, and they called it a black pit. Now, the Germans are smart cookies. They have broken many of our codes, including the code we use to communicate to the convoys. And this meant Dönitz knew where all the convoys were going to be, and he sent small groups of U-boats to attack the convoys. And they called them wolf packs. Every single convoy was hammered. There were countless boats and lives lost. It was imperative that we cracked the enigma. And it came down to Alan Turing. He sat down with everything that had been learned about the enigma. He sat down and he worked out how the Navy were doing it. They were doing something similar yet different to the Air Force with the code book. This meant that before they could make any progress, they had to go and recover documents from the enemy. And so a new game was afoot. Now, this photograph is Alan Turing's office. And we went to the park, I was there one Sunday first thing, and we're in the Hitler Block 8, where he worked. And I walked into this office, and you feel when you walk in the weight of history bearing down amongst you. Some books say he solved the enigma in this room, some say he solved it in the attic rooms of the park. But either way, this man solved the naval enigma. But they needed these documents from the enemy vessels. They called them pinchers. They needed that. And the only place you can get them is from the enemy. So off they went. The German Navy used weather vessels to report the weather weather at sea. And they did this via the enigma. So we attacked weather vessels and we recovered some of the documents. But the code's altered once a month, so we need regular sets of these documents. And this is where a young lieutenant commander enters our story. Now, this is completely off the wall, this story. It's like something you'd hear from a boys' war story comic or James Bond. So I'm going to tell it as a war story comic. This lieutenant commander went racing in to see his senior officers and said, "What else could be? I've had a brilliant idea." And they listened and said, "It's bonkers." And they accepted it, and they created what they called Operation Ruthless. And Ruthless took a very small group of troops. And they all had certain skills. They were fluent in German, they were pilots, and they were comfortable with a lot of violence. I mean, killing. A lot of it they were extremely comfortable with. And then they distressed them as though they'd been through a war. They took an enemy aeroplane and they distressed that. Well, you can't tell where the bullet hole came from. And so you've got distressed men in a distressed plane. And they waited until a squadron came over to bomb England. And when it went over, they let everything carry on as is. And then, when the bombing was done, the squadron flew home. And on the end of our squadron, our plane flies and it becomes the tail end of the squadron. And the squadron is now going back across the sea, and as it's going over the sea, our tail end plane dives into the sea, sends a radio call saying, "I'm going down, and they bail out. Nearby German vessel realises that our troops in the sea turn around, pick them up, get them on board, and our troops kill everybody on board, steal the vessel, and then drive it home to Blighty. It sounds like something out of James Bond, doesn't it? And the reason it probably sounds like something out of James Bond is because the man, the 32-year-old man who invented it, was a man named Ian Fleming. This is what he did in the war. But in 1941 May, they had a real stroke of luck. a wolf pack was attacking a convoy, and a corvette fired and it hit submarine U-boat 110, captained by Captain Fitzjulius Lem. And U-110 was going down, and the Enigma operator had all these documents, and he knew how important they were, and he said to Captain Lem, "What do I do?" And Lem said, "The boat's going down, leave them. The sea will hide them." And he did, and they abandoned the U-boat. And a party of the Royal Navy, led by Lieutenant Barn, boarded it and recovered all these documents. I mean, they were sodden because the thing was going down. Didn't know what they were. They grabbed them all up, including an envelope. They took them all back, and these were immediately whisked straight back to Bletchley. I mean, the obvious place to send these documents is to the park, but they didn't. They sent them to the British Museum, because they have got all the equipment to dry them out. So they dried them out, including that envelope. And when they could look at the envelope was the missing link. The Germans had a code book. The Navy used what they called big room tables. And the big room tables and other documents worked together to provide you the settings. Now they could really make progress on cracking the naval enigma. And the King said this was one of the most important events at sea during the war. But whilst they're working on it, they still needed cribs. And they decided the best way to get the crib is to get the Germans to give us them. So they went to the RAF. And they said, "We're going to take an area at sea, CF-97, where nothing's going on, to the RAF. Will you please go out there and bomb it? There's no one or nothing there. Just go out and bomb CF-97. And the RAF did. Went out there, dropped some bombs, came home. And then they waited. And before long, there'd be a signal. Why are the Englanders bombing CF-97? I don't know. Why are they bombing CF-97? But what you've really got in those signals is the enemy are sending you a crib. If you know what you're looking for, it's easy to find. And this practice they called gardening. But then a month later, in June 1941, a really important convoy was en route back from the States. Hotel X-Ray 113. He was heading towards England, and Hotel X-Ray 113 was attacked by a wolfpack. But by now, they'd cracked the naval enigma. They knew what was going on, and they were in readiness. The battle was long and bloody, but at the end of the battle, 2 U-boats were sunk. They had cracked the naval enigma. Within 1 month, naval sinkings were down by a third. That's a third less lost vessels and a third less lost lives. The Royal Navy saw the benefit of this, and under Derby House in Liverpool, they set up a command centre. And all the signals were passed overnight to Derby House, and they used these to reroute the convoys away from the wolfpacks. The Germans are not stupid. They realised that somewhere we were getting certain intel, and they didn't know where it was coming from. They thought we might have cracked enigmas, but that was preposterous. So they then thought it must be from the secretaries in France. When they invaded France, all the secretaries were co-opted to work for the German army, and they assumed that they got the intel and were leaking it. But in the spring of 1941, the Park tried an experiment. Up until now, the bombs had been operated by men, but the men were needed at the front. So they trained 8 Wrens to operate the bombs. Now this is a rhetorical question. Do you think the women could operate the bombs? Do you think they had mentally what it took? Because I ain't going to tell you the answer. What I am going to say is at the height of the war, at the height of the war, there were 2,000 bomb operators. Of these, 1,676 were women. I think that kind of makes the point, doesn't it? But being a bomb operator, this is the bomb that's looking for the settings out of 150 million. It's boring. You sat there all the time and you waited for it to stop, You go to a code breaker, more waiting, and then they come back and you carry on until you crack the signal. If you're lucky, in the tour of duty, you crack 1 or 2 sets of settings. And they hated it. Things were so secret, no one could ever tell them why they were doing what they were doing. And there was lots of mumblings. So the hierarchy said, we need to tell them not everything, but enough, so these people know exactly how important this boring task is. And then the park got busier and busier and busier as the war went on. One lady, Jo Bailey, described it as so exciting. The atmosphere was incredible, even though they knew that if they got it wrong, then people would die. But this was all still top secret. And it's so top secret. The cover was the Government Code and Cipher School, but it was so top secret to what they were really doing. They were surprised one day when the RAF, you see, like every RAF plane then was, buzzed very low over one of the billets, very near to the park. This ought not to happen. No one ought to be looking anywhere near us. And they didn't know why. But it was a lovely, hot summer's day. And this lady, Bailey, her sister was on night. But it was far too hot to sleep. And so what her sister had done is decided to go to the top of the billet and do a little bit of sunbathing. Yeah, you got it. In the nude. More and more flavours of ciphers were coming on, and they were all being cracked. And there was a worry that if they ever twigged that we had cracked the signals, all would be lost. Darkness would fall if this was the case. Now I want to tell you a story now about how a young code breaker from the park, this lady, 19-year-old Mavis Beatty, the impact that this lady had on the war. In the spring of 1941, Mussolini and Hitler amalgamated, united by common fruitcakeness. And so they had now this enormous army. And Mavis Beatty was working on a massive signal from the Italian Navy. This thing was absolutely enormous, and 11 o'clock at night, Mavis Beatty finally cracked the signal. Read it, couldn't believe her eyes, and went racing into the naval hut with the signal. Now at the time, our Mediterranean fleet was anchored off Alexandria, North Africa. And the signal that Mavis had cracked was the Italian Navy's battle plan for 3 days' time to go surprise attack and take out our fleet in harbour. Now, the commander of the fleet, Admiral Cunningham rather, he was one of the 30 people who knew the secret of the park, and Cunningham was immediately told, and he immediately started making plans. And as luck would have it, the day before the attack, he was at a do. Now, Alexandria was a hotbed for spies, and Cunningham knew that at the party there would be at least one spy, probably more. And so every single person he saw at the party, he told them, tomorrow, the day of the attack, tomorrow I'm playing golf. This would have been relayed back to the Italian Navy. If the Admiral's playing golf, he hasn't got a clue what's going on. At midnight, he snuck back on board, took the fleet out to sea, and a battle you might have heard of the next day was the Battle of Matapan. And the cream of the Italian Navy was wiped out. All thanks to a code broken by a 19-year-old girl called Mavis Beatty. Well, Cunningham decided, next time I'm back in Blighty, I want to see the people who helped. I want to see that signal. I want to see it for myself. And so he came to the park. And a small group of people who were involved were asked to meet him. They were taken to a small new room, being recently painted, or rather nice. They took him to this room, and they're all young, these women, young and excited, and admirals coming to see us. And so they played a prank. It had been recently painted, and they persuaded Admiral Cunningham to lean up against the wall. And this meant that by the time he left, he had a nice big white stripe right the way down the back of his uniform. But the Germans sent fake signals to confuse us, and even this worked to our favours. Again, Navy's matey picked up one of these signals. Now, one thing Enigma will never do, it will never translate a letter to itself. And Mavis looked at the signal, and if you look at it, there's not a single letter L in that signal. This was a dummy signal, and they worked it out. The Enigma operator was sending a dummy signal, he's having a fag break. And when he had his fag, he put his finger on the letter L. The whole signal was an enormous crib. If you know what you're looking for, it's easy to find. Well, the Prime Minister had been desperate to get America to enter the war, and Roosevelt wasn't having any of it until the 7th of May 1941 and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the Americans had cracked Enigma Purple for the Japanese. They knew what it was all about, but they misinterpreted what they were reading. America entered the war. If you want to hear a different side of code breaking and code making, Carol does a wonderful talk on the skills of the Native American code talkers. You might think, oh, it's exactly the same. There's nothing in common with this talk. It is the brilliance of the Native Americans and the massive impact they had on the war. And there's nothing in my talk, in Carol's talk. It's a belter of a talk. But then, the successes backfired, and Dönitz started to consider, is it possible they have cracked Enigma? So what Dönitz did was he made certain that the Enigma, everything about it was upgraded. And all of a sudden, it went dark. Nobody could read any naval Enigma. Now the bombs could cope. The bombs could cope with the new Enigma, but it took a lot longer, between 50 and 100 times longer, up to 17 days. Now look at the Battle of Matapan. They had 3 days. If you take 17 days to crack a signal, it's too late. And in those 17 days, the bombs aren't doing what else they're meant to be doing as well. So this could not continue. And the sinkings went through the roof. The wolf packs beat us every time. We were losing the battle. But then Lady Luck intervened again. And U-boat 559 was spotted 70 miles north of Africa. It was spotted, harried, attacked, and U-boat 559 was sinking. And when it was sinking, they abandoned it. And the crew from HMS Petard boarded 559 as it was going down. And like they'd done with U-110, they recovered all the documents, every single one, that was sent back to the park. Now, I don't know if anyone ever seen the film U-571. It's meant to be the film of this incident. It's a wonderful film. It's got nothing to do with reality. If you like a good war film, it's a good film. Just don't believe it. For 9 months, they could read none of the naval signals. Not a one of the sinkings went through the roof. And there's a lovely story 9 months later on of everyone in the canteen and someone came racing in to say we're back on the U-boats. And they had cracked the signals. And they remained cracked until the end of the war. And the park got busier and busier and busier. They were all busy bees. But the Second Battle of the Atlantic was going to be won. Now, tracking all these signals was incredibly stressful work, but I don't want to give you the idea there was never any fun. Anyone who's been to the park will know it's full of very, very long, dead straight corridors. And they used to move signals around these corridors on these enormous trolleys. Well, one day the debutantes had picked up one of these trolleys and they were using it like a go-kart. And the deb who was later to become Lady Trumpington was put into the trolley and they were racing down the corridor at warp speed. Now, through accident or design, I don't know, they let go. So now, Lady Trumpington is flying down the corridor at warp speed, and at the end of the corridor is a door. Trumpington is out of control, and the trolley comes hurtling through the door. I can't find it in any of the books, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that this is the one and only time that Lady Trumpington spent a lot of time in the men's loops. Now this part impacts every single person. I'm going to guess that every single person in this room has got something impacted by this part of the talk. Look in your pocket or your bag. The people who worked at the park, the code breakers, were brilliant people. But it doesn't mean they never made mistakes. And early on in the war, when they couldn't read a lot, they came across one flavour of enigma that they couldn't read. And they thought it was unimportant. And then an enigma operator made a mistake. They sent a signal of 3,976 characters, and then they sent it again, a duplicate. Now to us that wouldn't help, but to a code breaker it gave them all they needed, and they could crack the signal. It was different to any other signal they'd seen, and it talked about the removal of a gun battery. So all of a sudden this unimportant little signal, this flavour of enigma, became really interesting, and they wanted to crack it. I don't know what it is, but we need to find it. And the reason they couldn't crack it is because it was not created by the enigma. It was created by this thing. This is the Lorenz. There were three main Lorenz types during the war. And where the enigma has got 4 rotors, this thing has got 12. When the enigma has got 150 million settings, this thing, and that's the proper number, is 104 followed by 28 million possible settings. It was superior in so many ways. Where the enigma needed 3 operators, this needed 1. This could work on or offline. This was a wonderful thing. And they gave it to a man named Bill Tutt and his team to see if they could crack it. And they did. It was classed as a near miracle. I told you these people were brilliant, and they cracked it. But the bombs couldn't cope with this, and they needed Bomb Mark II. And so they went to the Post Office Research Unit at Dilly Hill, northwest London, and to a man named Wynne Williams. And they said to Wynne Williams, we want you to make us the equivalent of the bomb. And he beetled off, and with his team, they came back a few months later, and they came back with a prototype. Has anyone seen Heath Robinson? The sort of the weird, wonderful contraptions he comes out with? Well, this was like Heath Robinson, so they called it Robinson. It was held together with sticky tape and string, and there were wires everywhere. But it worked. And then one of his team, a man called Tommy Flowers, he said, I can make it better. So they go on, and Tommy goes off. And Tommy went away, and he came back with his prototype. More sticky tape, more string, but he brought this prototype, and it was called the Colossus. And it worked. It was brilliant. So then, the military said to Tommy, how long will it take you to make the prototype and give us a full-scale model? And Tommy said, not a problem, I'll do it in a year. This is the wrong answer. This is December 1943. What Tommy doesn't know is that D-Day is 6 months away. So Tommy and his team went away, and they worked around the clock, aided massively by this young man called Alan Turing. And on the 1st of June 1944, they returned with the real Colossus, and it worked. It was far more complex than the bomb. It needed teams of 4 to operate it, 2 Wrens and 2 men. And there was a tremendous amount of complicated setting up that was needed to operate the Colossus. And they worked in this enormous room. There were 300 Colossus operators. And the work was hard, it was tiring, it was noisy, it's incredibly hot. And they worked under the guidance of a man named Newman, Max Newman. That's what his name now, Max Newman. And even though it was very stressful work, he made it light-hearted for them. And so even though they were stressed to bits, they loved him for it, and they all therefore worked in the unit called the Newman Ring. So why is this important? This is important because the Colossus is the very first electronic programmable computer. Every computer you've got, from the one on the wrist to the one in your pocket and your phone, and upwards, everything is the great-great-great-grandson from the Colossus. So we're now storming towards D-Day, and they were cracking absolutely everything. There was no signal they couldn't crack by now, including the one that was so massive, it was in 32 bits, and it gave the full detailed battle plan for how to defend when we invaded D-Day at Calais, where they thought we were going to be. At the height of the war, there were 3/4 of the 9,000 people were women. D-Day took place, and every single signal was cracked. But then, a month after D-Day, the worst nightmare came true. The Germans twigged that the codes had been cracked. Now, up until then, some codes had been altered every day, some every month, but now every code was updated every day, and they couldn't cope. So they went back to the government and they said, we need more money for Colossus, and the government couldn't pay it fast enough. On the 7th of May 1945, a young student called Asa Briggs received a signal unencoded, and he said the Germans had surrendered. Victory in Europe. Atomic bombs were dropped in Japan, 2 of them, and in September of 1945, Japan surrendered, and the Second World War was over. But I want to remind you of something. As we've gone through, we've talked about all the victories for the park. Be clear, every time I talk about a victory for the park, somebody got killed. And like I said at the beginning, the people who got killed were people doing what their government told them to do. They didn't want to fight any more than our lads wanted to fight. And the park leaves a legacy. It leaves it in 2 forms. At the beginning of my talk, I said, who's not happy with the government? And I gave all the things you can do if you're not happy. The reason you can do them is because we have those freedoms, in part bought by the park. They didn't win the war, but they played a massive part in giving us those freedoms. But the other legacy is after the war, when the park evolved and it became something that we all know today as GCHQ. They operate in the darkness, looking after us as they did all those years ago. Well, I've attempted to condense an incredibly complex area. I can't cover all of it. It's too massive. But I hope you get the idea that everything was this massive wheel. It wasn't simply the code breakers. Everyone worked together to work the park and to break the codes. And over the past few years, I've got a proper library of books on the park, and of course we've been there. And it was a real eye-opener. Every single time I opened a book, there was something new and mind-numbing. And I hope tonight has been a little bit of an eye-opener to you as well. But I'm going to leave you. The final words came from the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister, Winston, he described the park as the goose that laid the golden eggs that never cracked. So we've got to the end of my inane dribble. I hope it's been fairly informative. If you have liked it, we've got all the details of my talks and Carol talks over there. But in the meantime, if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask.
I think you've stunned everybody. I think it was such a story.
It is.
Could I ask, were the Germans ever on the trail of the code breakers? Did they have an inkling that there was a serious code breaking operation did the Germans, or did it just bypass them?
Yeah, they cracked a number of our codes.
Sorry, I meant Bletchley Park itself. Were they aware of something like that existence?
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
Bizarrely, there was a spy in the park, a man, what his name, Ken Cross, who was a spy in the park. If you've seen the film, forget everything you hear about it then. He worked on the Lorentz. But there was a spy in the park, he worked for the Russians.
Right.
They were on our side at the time. John Cairncross was his name. If you believe what you see in the film.
Well, if I may, oh, this is working. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Let me just thank Dave for really a spectacular talk. I found it really immensely uplifting. I suppose my generation, I'm in my 70s, my generation, my parents went right through the war, and their experiences of the war have always made a great impression on me. I was a great admirer of them. And I find, as I said, hearing the story of what went on by their generation in the wartime, I find incredibly uplifting, and even now a sense of pride at what was achieved by those people. And something I think that's most important for us, if I may say, in the Friends. I think the Friends of St Cuthbert's, we're going through some very difficult times at the moment, and it's marvellous to hear other people in this story facing incredible difficulties. When they sorted them all out, so it seems now relatively easy, but it was immensely difficult, the challenges that they faced. But they came through it. And I think by you coming here and talking tonight, you've certainly given me a great deal of encouragement that even the worst difficulties can be overcome, as long as you could think as broadly as they thought. And boy, they were fairly ruthless too, weren't they, in the way they tackled those problems. So thank you. And if I can ask you to join with me in thanking Dave for what I personally found a most stimulating and, as I say, uplifting talk. I hope you did too. But if we can put our hands together and give... And I'm sure there's more tea and coffee at the back and biscuits and all the rest, so do enjoy some of that.